Today we are looking at, anybody ever see these around? As I get through the lesson, this was the best thing that I thought I'd like to leave you with in terms of this text about the healing of the 10 lepers. So I know I've preached on this before, so I want to do three things with the text. First, I want to look at what I think is the Samaritan leper that comes back. I want to look at his curious sort of obedience. And that's something I've done before, and I want to bring it up because not understanding that is really a source of division in Christianity, and I think it could be healed if we understand how to approach God the way we see the leper and others in the Bible approach God. So I want to look at his curious obedience. Then I want to look at the story of the 10 lepers in the context of the Gospel of Luke. We've been studying the Gospel of Luke and sort of following this discussion Jesus is having, not the Pharisees kind of religion, teaching his disciples that it's really different. It's not like that, but this is what it should be about. And then the last thing I want to do is I want to look at that statement at the end when Jesus says to the leper, he says, arise and go your way, your faith has saved you or made you well. I want to figure that out and how that is any different than maybe the other 9 who were also healed. So I want to do those three things. So first, just talking about this leper's curious obedience. I say that because we know Jesus said, what's the command Jesus gave to these 10 lepers? Anybody know? Go show yourself to the priest. Okay, right now, sort of in Christianity, there's two general ways, principles by which people hear God's commands and think about following them. One of them is called the regulative principle, and the other is called the normative principle. And so the normative principle is this idea that while doing what God says, free to express yourself to God in any other way you want to. That's not forbidden by God. You have this freedom to approach God in your thankfulness or your praise or your worship, whatever, as long as it's not forbidden by God. That's a normative principle. The Restoration Movement follows John Calvin in what's called the regulative principle. And that principle is that you only may offer God what he's required. You may not add anything. Okay? And in order to teach this, in order to get people to follow this way of thinking, this regulative principle, usually there's a couple of stories from the Old Testament that are sort of corralled into telling you that this is how you have to do it. Can anybody name one of those stories? Anybody? Like Nadab and Abihu, okay? So there's kind of a threat there. It's like, they messed around and bam, they got zapped. Well, that story doesn't really fit this discussion, and I'll tell you why. There was a guy that I went to the Buena Park School of Evangelism with. His name was Pat Wisnant. Nice guy, and he had a way of thinking about this. And he said, Randy, let's say, and this is my best memory of the way he characterized it. Let's say your mom, you're a kid, and your mom sent you to the store to buy eggs. So go buy eggs. So I go to the store to buy eggs. Okay? Then I come home, and I've not only bought the eggs, but just because I love my mom, I also bought flowers, not with her money, with my own. Okay? And I bought flowers, and I brought them home to my mom, and I said, and here, Mom, I bought you some flowers. Now, she didn't ask me to buy her flowers, and so under this regulative principle, she would chastise me. She would be mad at me and say, why did you buy me flowers? I asked for eggs. I only wanted eggs. I didn't tell you to buy me flowers, so you were not allowed to buy me flowers. Now, you and I believe that's ridiculous, don't we? Yeah. So Pat, he was pointing out, going that way with the Bible is sort of ridiculous if we think of God as a loving father. You see, if he's our father and he tells us to buy eggs, as long as we buy eggs, he doesn't mind if we also bring home flowers and say, hey, Dad, I love you, here's some flowers. That was Pat's point. And it's always stuck with me. I've thought about that. And so if you think about Nadab and Abihu, their issue is not that they also bought flowers. Their issue is they didn't buy the eggs. They didn't even do what God asked. That's what they're taken to task for. God says, hey, I'm going to be honored. You can't come and not honor me when you come before me. So their problem is not that they didn't buy eggs. Their problem is that they didn't buy eggs. It's not that they added the idea of buying flowers. The other story that is commonly used to make sure you do it the way I say you should do it. Anybody know the other one? Who? The guy that touched the ark? Yeah, Jim's right. Uzzah. See? Uzzah, however you say it. This guy, they say, you better not do anything different or God's going to zap you like Uzzah. Again, Uzzah's situation, when Israel under David is deciding to move the ark, the situation is not that he bought the eggs and added flowers, right? God specifically said, when you move the ark, we're not talking about the ark of Noah, okay, if anybody's confused. When you move the Ark of the Covenant, which is the holiest box overlaid with gold, beautiful with the mercy seat, and the blood was shed on there, and sins forgiven, really important item. When you're moving it, it had these gold rings in it, and you put these poles through, and you pick it up by the poles. You never touch it. And so there were specific instructions on how to move that thing that they did not consult when they were bringing it back. And so, it's not that they, added flowers. They didn't buy the eggs. Does that make sense? They were not obeying God. Now, here's what's interesting to me. One of the very stories that people use to make you follow it the way I follow it is Uzzah and the story of moving the ark. The crazy thing is, that story proves you're allowed to buy God flowers. It does. If you go back and read through the story of moving the ark that time, you find out that once David realized that they had not consulted the Lord and that they had not transported the ark correctly, they had put it up on a cart, and that's why it tipped and somebody had to touch it to stop it. Once you understand that David went back and bought the eggs, he went back and obeyed the Lord. They put the poles, they were carrying it with the poles. Once they were obeying the Lord, David appears to be going under the normative principle, not the regulative principle, because he adds a whole bunch of flowers. Study that story. He is so excited and just ecstatic in his worship that God's ark is coming back to Israel. He's so excited that he does a bunch of other stuff that's not part of what God required. He starts sacrificing animals every so many steps. God didn't say anything about that. He added flowers. He added musicians and singing and playing instruments and all this music as the ark is being moved. There's none of that. None of that is required for moving the ark. It's not there. And then he also added dancing, and dancing in a way that his wife gets upset about. It's not very modest. But he's dancing because he's just so excited that the ark is being returned to his people. All of those are bouquets of flowers that David has added. But he's moving the ark the way God said. And so as I look at the story, I don't see David following this regulative principle that says, you may only do what I said if you do what I said and do something else, I'm going to zap you. I don't see David doing that. Nor do I see it in our story today. That's what I want you to see. I don't think this is Luke's purpose for giving us this story. I don't think it's why Jesus told the story. But I do think, in the context of how we approach the Bible, that we need to notice. Because I was taught to follow by the regulative principle. And when I come across these stories, I say to myself, the Bible doesn't quite look like what I was taught. Should we do that? Should I do that? Should I just go by what I was taught, or should I notice when the Bible seems different? Okay? That's what I was told. In our church, we want to go by the Bible. So I look at David and I say, man, he's adding all this stuff. And God seems to be on his side, because when his wife gets mad at him, the text tells us, and she was barren for the rest of life. It doesn't come out and say God, did that, but it sure seems to be saying God approved of David's worship and didn't approve of people saying, hey, you shouldn't do that. And that means I don't want to be somebody saying, hey, you shouldn't do that, when somebody's obeying God and adding bouquets of flowers. Fair enough? This guy in our story today, the one who came back, he also does not seem to be following this kind of legalistic, kind of military authority. You were commanded to do something, and there's only one way to do it. He doesn't seem to be following that. And so read along with me and see if you agree with that, okay? Excuse me. Let me just grab a sip here. On the way to Jerusalem, he was passing along between Samaria and Galilee. And as he entered a village, he was met by 10 lepers who stood at a distance, and lifting up their voices, saying, Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. When he saw them, he said to them, go and show yourself to the priests. Now there's the commandment, right? Is there anything gray about that? Is there many different ways how that might be interpreted? It seems pretty straightforward, doesn't it? So let's say we're over here with Jesus, and the priest is over there at the stairs. The commandment is for them to do what? Right? That's pretty clear, okay? But is that what happens? Doesn't seem like that's what, 90%. It doesn't seem like that's what happens, right? It doesn't seem like that's what happened, okay? And as they went, so where are we? Are we here? We're not here. Are we over there? No, where are we at? We're somewhere in here. Is that right? So somewhere in here, as they went, something happened, right? Then, as they went, sorry, did we skip one? Okay. As they went, they were cleansed. So right in here somewhere, right? Not there and not there. In here somewhere. Okay? As they went, they were cleansed. Then, one of them, when he saw that he was cleansed, did what? Okay. Did I get over there? No. I turned back. Right? Praising God with a loud voice. Did Jesus say anything about turning back? Did he say anything about praising God? Did he ask for any of this? He didn't ask for any of this, right? And he fell on his face at Jesus' feet, giving him thanks. Did he ask for any of that? Right? What did Jesus tell him to do? Go show. The only way to obey this command under the regulative principle, okay, is for that Samaritan and the other 9 to make it all the way to the priest and show themselves to the priest. That would be obeying that command, right? But this guy's doing something different, right? This guy decided that he was so enthralled and excited and ecstatic about being healed, he wanted to say thank you to Jesus. And so he turned around. Now, I am fully confident that this guy is going to ultimately do what? I don't believe he's going to disobey that, especially since if he wants to be reincorporated into his community, if he wants to be able to rejoin his family and his friends, maybe go back to work, he won't be able to do any of that if he doesn't go show himself to the priest. He's going to do that. So there's no question of disobedience here, but he felt like doing something else. And how does God respond to that? Under the regulative principle, you're going to have somebody yell at you about Nadab and Abihu or Uzzah. But it just isn't so. He came back, and what's Jesus' response? Then Jesus answered, "Were not 10 cleansed? Where are the 9? I love that question. That is a crazy, sort of ridiculous question. Because where are the other 9, do you know? Sherry, they're doing what? They're showing themselves to the priest. Man, why would they be doing that? They're doing exactly what Jesus said to do. So this conversation kind of goes weird because the 9 that are doing exactly what Jesus said to do, although it's not like he's not mad at them, he's not going to take back the cleansing, but they definitely are not the heroes in the text. Can you see that? How many of us want to be heroes to God? How many of us want to be that kind of over the top, we love you and we want to be your people, God? Anybody? I do. We're told that the way to be that kind of hero is sort of, without even thinking about it in a sort of rote, mechanical way, just do as God said without anything else and just go show yourself to the priest. But that's not what I see in the text. In the text, those guys went to see the priest, like Jesus said. And then probably were so happy they were cleansed, they went back to their families and did all that stuff. But this Samaritan, is so overwhelmed by the love of God, by the grace of God, by the mercy of God, by the cleansing of God, that he doesn't see any problem with bringing the flowers. He sort of brought the flowers even before he bought the eggs, right? It's like he was on his way to buy the eggs, and there was a flower cart and a guy selling flowers that were beautiful, and he said, gee, maybe my mom would love those. And so he bought some flowers for his mom and brought them back and said, Mom, I just love you so much, here's some flowers. And she doesn't strike him down. She doesn't get mad at him because she experiences his love. Is God not our Father? So even in this case, even before buying the eggs, he's going to buy the eggs. I believe he's going to buy the eggs. But he brings home flowers first. And what's Jesus' disposition toward that kind of obedience? We're not 10 cleansed, we're the 9. He seems to be saying, this guy has it right. Was no one found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner? Yeah, that's about it. And he said to him, rise and go your way, your faith has made you well. You see, so as I approach the text, I don't find this kind of regulative principle where, where God said, this is it, and you must only do this, don't do anything else. Don't say thank you, unless I tell you to. This does not seem to reflect what people are doing with God in the Bible. And it just feels like those things are used, those kinds of principles are used to control and make sure you do what I think you should do. And, we have to be able to be like David. Amen? We have to be able to be like this leper. Amen? And in none of those cases is anybody saying disobey God. But we're just saying God has given us tremendous freedom to be able to express it to him and say thank you. And I dare say it's probably even the dangerous side of things to try to squelch or step on or derail or speak against somebody else's bouquet of flowers. I think that's a principle. I think I see that, and that's the way I want to follow. Okay? So that's what I think is really important about this text, even though that's not exactly the way Luke is offering it. But I think it still speaks to us today, maybe prophetically, because it speaks to our context. Now, in context, what's Luke doing with the text? What's Jesus doing teaching this? Generally, when Jesus is healing somebody or doing something special like that, it usually has to do with something he's teaching. You remember the guy who was blind and Jesus healed him, but it didn't work, sort of? And then he healed him again, and then it worked better? Anybody remember that one? It's not that he was tired or he didn't have lunch or, didn't get enough rest the night before. He was teaching something through this healing. And so he was trying to show his disciples, I know you're calling me Messiah, but you don't know what that means yet. So you're not really going to understand what it means until you stop self-seeking and lay your life down and follow me. And I'm about to go die. I mean, until you do that, you're just not going to see things clearly. That's what Jesus is doing in that healing. And the same thing here. This story fits into the context of what Jesus has been teaching and what Luke has been showing us about Jesus' teaching for weeks now. And so what is this story saying to the disciples? You remember last week, Jesus basically asked the disciples, I want you to be like God in forgiving people, even if they sin against you 7 times in a day. And the disciples are like, man, who could do that? You need to increase our faith. Will you please increase our faith? Isn't this story about faith? This story is about faith. It's about incredible faith. Because if you think about it, these guys are standing there with leprosy. And, or whatever it is, a skin disease. Various skin diseases were called that. So here they have these skin diseases. And Jesus says, go show yourself to the priest, okay? Let's switch it up. Let's say you're standing there and you've got a cast on your arm. And you say, Jesus, I want you to heal me. And Jesus says, go to the coach and have him put you in the baseball game. What do you do? See, if you're thinking like anybody would think, you're going to say, Jesus, I don't mean to tell you your business, but I think you got it back. There's something backwards here. I can't go to the coach and have him put me in the game because of this cast on my arm. So, I want to go to the coach and have him put me in the game, but could you do something about the cast first? Isn't that how we think? See, that would make sense to us. But these guys with skin disease, with leprosy or whatever it is, Jesus says, go to the priest, and with this disease, they did what? They did. They went to show themselves to the priest. Can you see how that may end in humiliation? Right? Walking up to the priest's hut or tent or whatever he's living in, and you still got this disease, and you're like, I'm clean. Jesus said so. Can I go back? Right? And the priest's like, you're still, get out of here. You yell around unclean in the forest and get away from me. You're setting yourself up for humiliation doing what Jesus said. But they did it. It's a story about faith. They said, Jesus, increase our faith. And Jesus went on to basically say faith wasn't the issue. And that's why I have that. Did I have it here? Yeah, that's why I have this here. Just do it. He basically said faith isn't the issue, man. If you had the tiniest bit of faith, you could move mountains. You could cast mulberry trees and plant them in the sea. Faith isn't the issue. Just do it. Forgive people 9 times in a day. Just try it. See how it works. Didn't Jesus teach, if anyone chooses to do my will, what I say, then he will know that my teaching comes from God. Anybody remember that? By offering ourselves to God and doing it, we'll find out that what he's saying is true. Romans 12, in view of God's mercy, offer your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual worship, or however that's differently translated. Do not conform to the pattern of this world any longer, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, right? So here we're offering ourselves to God. We're seeking his transforming power. And then he says, and then you will be able to test and approve what the will of God is, his good and perfect and pleasing will. Then, when? After we submit ourselves to the will of God, we'll find out. You see? And so here are these disciples that we can't forgive. And Jesus says, look, it's not the way of the world, okay? Number one, you got to see yourself as servants. You're servants. So don't expect, thanks. Don't expect to, you didn't earn or deserve anything. You're servants. And you should be like the master. Your job as a servant is to be like your master. That's your particular job right now. And what's your master like? He's a servant. So it's nothing like what those guys, those religious leaders are doing. It's completely different. And so, forgive. And they're like, oh, increase our faith. And then Jesus has a story about faith. These guys are told to go to the priest. Doesn't make any sense, Jesus. Just do it. Just do it. That's one thing. But the other side of it is, and this is that last statement there, he says, rise and go your way. Your faith has made you well. Maybe he's only stating the obvious. Maybe this guy only got what the other 9 got. Okay? Right? Because what's different? Like, when they left Jesus on the way, their leprosy or whatever was taken away, right? So is Jesus talking about that? That's what everybody got, and praise God, that's awesome. But is there anything more? You see, some translations say your faith has saved you, and people are uncomfortable with that because they're like, well, I mean, we're not talking about, here's your ticket to heaven here. So how do we translate it? Okay, made you well. Well, everybody's faith made them well, right? But I'm thinking it's not just that. I think this guy is further along than the other 9. I think this guy, Jesus is saying something about how this guy has found himself by faith that is a wellness that the other 9 don't have. Now, why do I think that? Because as I said earlier, remember when Jesus said you got to be willing to leave father and mother and wife and kids, and you got to love me more than all that? This guy actually does it. Right? He actually puts off all that celebration he could have with family and all that stuff to come back to Jesus. So that's one thing. The other thing is, this guy has a skin disease, and he recognizes that he's been healed of that, and he finds himself thankfully worshiping at the feet of Jesus. Isn't that where wellness is found? Gratitude, thankfulness, worshiping at Jesus' feet. Are we going to find any of the religious leaders there? No, they don't know they got leprosy. This guy is so thankful for what he's received that his thankfulness causes him to come back and just pour out this gratitude and worship to Jesus. Right? This guy has been healed, and he's received so much. Is it possible that this guy might be willing to forgive somebody else? Or do what he can to help somebody else? You see, there's a power to receiving. It makes us something different. And this guy received so much that it changes. It changed him, it'll change us. You and I, maybe we don't have a skin disease, but humanity has a sin disease. Isn't that right? We have a sin disease. And we have, our sin is destroying our relationships with God and with each other, and so we're not well. And Jesus says, I'll tell you where you can be made well, right? At the foot of the cross, we can't see this behind that, but at the foot of the cross, recognizing what Jesus has done, falling down in worship and praise and thanks, humbling ourselves to recognize what God has given us so freely. That's a place of wellness. That's a place where anybody can be made well. And so everybody, this is the way to be made well, to be saved. Recognize that we have a sin disease, and recognize that only an act of God can cleanse us from that. Only an act of God can restore us to our communities, to our families, to our jobs, to our everybody. And when we find ourselves there, the disciples have to find themselves there. They have to find themselves right there where this leper was. to be saved, to find their faith increased, to find the ability to be the people God has called them to be. I appreciate the text that Steve read in the supper. I quoted it last week. And that is where Jesus said, who's greater? The guy who sits at the table is being served, or the guy who's serving? Well, everybody knows it's the guy sitting there at the table. That's the world stuff. Jesus says, I'm among you as one who serves. He calls us to humility. He calls us to thankfulness. And it's only from there that we can become the people God has called us to be. And so if you've got a sin disease, bring it to the cross of Jesus. Look to him for salvation and in gratitude. You've got these cards. If you filled out these cards, you can pass them to the center. In a moment, we're going to stand. If there's anything you want to talk about in your own walk with God, if you find yourself struggling with a sin disease, come and talk to us about it. Jesus came to seek and save the lost. He came to forgive sin, and he wants to forgive your sin. So if there's anything you need to talk to us about, write it on the card, pass it in, or come down and talk to us up front. If there's nothing else, let's stand and sing this song.